Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us for another IDA Motivational Monday educational webinar. Today, I'm really excited. We're going to be having a book chat with Carolee D. Today's focus is going to be on narrative nonfiction picture books that will get kids excited about books, but that are also interesting for teachers and tutors to discuss with them. Our next Motivational Monday will be on the importance of morphology and early instruction, and our speaker will be Sue Hegland. Please continue to check our website, social media, and eBlast for more information on additional upcoming Motivational Mondays. And if you've missed any of our past sessions, feel free to check them out on IDA's digital library at dyslexialibrary.org. I do have some other announcements before we get started. To celebrate Teacher Appreciation Month, IDA is giving away 4 teacher memberships and 1 virtual registration to IDA's Dyslexia Conference, DyslexiaCon 2021. And we want to invite you to nominate your favorite reading teachers. So follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram for reminders to nominate teachers and links to the nomination process. We'll also be posting some of your submissions to celebrate all the amazing reading teachers that you know and love. The drawings for this will happen every Friday morning in May, so be sure to be on the lookout for that, and I invite you to nominate your teachers. I also want to encourage you to register for our blended conference experience October 21st through 23rd. It's going to be held in Charlotte, North Carolina. You can visit the IDA website at dyslexiaida.org for more information and for the registration link. And also remember to check out idatv.org for our latest new content, special collections, and power sessions. But now I'd like to introduce you to our presenter. Carolee D is a board-certified speech-language pathologist, dyslexia interventionist, and a member of ALTA and IDA. She's a former president of IDA's Southwest branch and currently is the regional rep for the Pacific region. She's also a frequent speaker at educational conferences, including ASHA and IDA's. She's the author of Story Frames for Teaching Literacy, Enhancing Student Learning Through the Power of Storytelling, which came out in April 2021 and is published by Brooks Publishing. She spent over 20 years working in the public schools with students from K to 12 and is now in private practice. She's also, if that wasn't enough, the author of award-winning young adult fiction and is a member of the Society of Children's Book Writers and Illustrators. So please join me in welcoming Carolee, and I'm going to let you take over. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you for that introduction, Janet. It's always lovely to spend time with you. So today we're going to have a book chat, and we're going to focus specifically on narrative nonfiction picture books. I love all types of children's literature, and I think that the plaque on the wall behind it kind of describes why. And what it says is, fairy tales are more than real, not because they teach us that dragons are real, but because they teach us that dragons can be beaten. And what I want to focus on today is that inspiration, since this is Motivational Monday, of how to inspire and lift the spirits of our children who may spend a lot of time struggling with reading. So these are the narrative nonfiction picture books that we will be discussing today, and they are for children of all ages, students of all ages, for teens as well as for younger children, and we'll be talking about why that is the case in just a minute. As Janet said, she has already told you some of my past experiences, but the experience I will be drawing on most today is my experience as a young adult author, as a member of the Society of Children's Book Writers and Illustrators, and that membership has actually led me into friendships with some fabulous children's authors whose books I'm going to be highlighting today. So, financial and non-financial disclosures. I will be talking about many titles, and some of them, not all of them, but some of them are written by friends and acquaintances of mine. I am the author of Story Frames for Teaching Literacy, and there will be a book list provided, a link. And so just so that you know, there is, that is provided by the publisher. And so I need to disclose that. We'll be talking about 14 narrative nonfiction picture books, and this book list has additional titles for chapter books and novels. I'm going to mention some big bookstore events I think that may be of interest to you. They are promotional in nature, so just be aware of that. But some of these wonderful authors that I'm talking about are going to be doing some events with me And I think you might like to hear from them about their titles, but be aware that any of these books can be checked out from your school or public library. And if your library doesn't have a title, you can usually get it through interlibrary loan. Some of the content I'm going to skim over very quickly today. If you would like to do a deeper dive into that, I will be presenting one of the content power sessions for the 2020 annual IDA conference that took place last year. There's ongoing power sessions that are being rolled out. Mine is in November. It's November 1st. And then the follow-up Q&A will be November 12th. And the title of that presentation is The Goldilocks Effect, Finding the Just Right Books for Struggling Readers. I am not going to post this entire PowerPoint for download just because there are some book covers that the publishers have allowed me to use, but they are copyrighted material. However, I will be posting some links as well as bibliography, but I want to draw your attention to two especially good articles that I think will be of interest to you. Both are found in the Perspectives on Language and Literacy, which if you are a member of IDA, you'll probably have online access to these. One is by Shanahan, Why Children Should Be Taught to Read with More Challenging Texts. And the other is by Scott and Balthazar, The Role of Complex Sentence Knowledge in Children with Reading and Writing Difficulties. So as we are looking for those books that are just right for our struggling students, some of the things that we need to consider are, what are the student factors? What are the strategies and supports that they have in place? What are our purposes for sharing a specific text for them? And what are the different types of texts? And all of those things support our decisions of what kind of text to use. And so looking at the student factors, we need to look at the reading strengths and weaknesses. If a student has undergone testing to evaluate their reading and writing, then what are their patterns of strengths and weaknesses? Some students can decode very fluently and read very fluently, but when you ask them any questions about what they've read or ask them to tell you what they've read, they have no idea. Other students have difficulty decoding, and they may be able to listen to a text and remember everything, but their decoding ability challenges their own ability to read independently. What is their attention level? What are their personal interests? And is there any room in the choosing of books where they have a choice? Not always, but is there any room for choice? What is their emotional fortitude? What is their stamina? Reading can be physically and emotionally exhausting. And so how long the books are, how long the chapters are that we share with them can impact that. And what is their use of strategies? They may have been taught all kinds of strategies, but can they use those strategies independently? So the next one is, what are our purposes? And our purposes for sharing a text often has to do with, who are we? Who is the person who is introducing the text? And I wear many hats when I share different books and types of texts. Sometimes I wear the parent hat, and as a parent, I'm sharing books with my children just to improve their joy of reading and their love of books. But when I'm working as a dyslexia interventionist, then a large part of what I do is to practice decoding. So I'm going to go to a very specific sort of text to practice decoding. When I'm wearing my SLP hat, I'm looking at the IEP goals and objectives of the students on my IEP caseload, my SLP caseload. And so if I have a goal for improving the understanding of narrative structure, improving vocabulary understanding and use, improving the ability to answer questions, those are going to influence the types of books that I choose. Sometimes our purpose is just to expose our students to the language of books. A classroom teacher may be choosing a book to explore a subject along the lines of history, the American Revolution, or science. Other purposes can be forming connections between family members. Some of you here are parents listening in today. And so forming those connections between past experiences, between parent and child, between peer groups. Those of us who are in book clubs know how important sharing books can be with forming social connections. Building emotional fortitude is a big one I want to talk about today. And choosing books, very often one of the most important things that I consider when choosing a book is, will this be an example of someone overcoming an obstacle which will inspire my students? And then, of course, leisure reading and developing a love of books are also very important. So we have our student factors, we have our purposes, and then we begin to narrow down what types of books do we want to choose. And then we look at strategies and supports, text-to-speech tools like Bookshare.org, Learning Ally, Reading Pens. Reading aloud is a very easy to implement support, reading aloud to your students or to your children. What are the comprehension strategies? Asking ourselves questions, learning how to self-question, learning how to visualize. Built-in supports. Does the text come with built-in supports? Is there a glossary? Is there a pronunciation guide for difficult words? And then text supports can be things like, if you have a Kindle book, if you highlight a word, oftentimes you can look that word up. There's a dictionary feature that will give you a pronunciation visually. Not always easy to read for our students because it may be different from the types of pronunciations guides that we've shared with them. But it is there nonetheless as text support. You can also type a word into dictionary.com and it'll say the word out loud for you, other types of text supports. And then pictography, which is a strategy of, I read a book to my students and they draw stick figures to help them listen and along to what's going on in the story. So then we have our student factors. What are our purposes for selecting a certain type of book? What is the support system? If the book is beyond our students' reading level, then the strategies and supports can make them accessible to them and open up more avenues of choice for them. And then the different text types. And in my presentation in November, I'm going to go into much greater detail about this, and I'll have lists for all these categories. Again, that is not the purpose for today. Today, we're going to focus on narrative nonfiction picture books. But all of these different types of texts, they have their strengths and they have their weaknesses. So as a dyslexia interventionist, decodable books and decodable texts, those are things that we use on a daily basis, and we use those often with our students to work on strategies, work on the syllable types that we've introduced to them so they have opportunity to be successful. And we want those decodable books to be in the range where they're 95% or more successful with reading the book. So we're presenting them with texts that we've specifically taught them, specifically and systematically taught them. So they're less likely to revert to inappropriate decoding strategies like guessing at words. They don't need to guess at words when they can be successful with those words. The limitation of decodable books is that there is a limited exposure to robust vocabulary, complex sentence structures, concepts. It's difficult to link these decodable books often to the curriculum because, as you know, the vocabulary of the curriculum is often difficult for our students to read. Another type of book are leveled readers. And there are two ways of looking at level readers. Sometimes publishers create a whole series just of books that are specifically for first grade or second grade or third grade. And then there are also, very different from that, are just your traditional novels and picture books. And there are lexiles that are assigned to those, not always, but if you go to something like Amazon.com and you go to the very bottom and scroll down to the bottom of the page, then you'll find what age group are they recommending a book for, and then the lexile. The downside and limitations of these leveled readers are that oftentimes what they're based on is word length and sentence length. So they are deceptively difficult for our students with dyslexia because even a short word can be very challenging if it has an irregular spelling. And a short sentence can be deceptively challenging if it includes complex sentence structures. Whereas a longer word with patterns, syllable patterns they've been taught may actually be easier than a longer word. And then we get into picture books. And what we're going to talk about today, narrative nonfiction picture books. There are all kinds of picture books, but our focus today is narrative nonfiction picture books. So I'll be talking a little bit more about that. Remember that most picture books are actually intended to be read by an adult to a child. And so these can also be deceptively more difficult than you might think, even though there is a lot of interesting pictures and they have complex vocabulary. And if you look at the lexile of these picture books, often the lexile of these picture books is higher or equal to chapter books and novels. And so they are wonderful for children to listen to, not so easy for them always to read, especially if they're struggling with decoding. Graphic novels, stories of high interest because of the graphic illustrations, but the limitations are that students can rely too much on picture support. They might guess at words. They might avoid the written text altogether and just scan the pictures. And then also sometimes these graphic novels have less traditional fonts that are actually difficult to read. Novels in verse, there's a lot of white space on the page, and it can give students a sense that they've read more pages. There's built-in time to pause because there might be one poem. So a novel in verse is stories told in a sequence of poems, usually free verse poems. And so there's a natural stopping place at the end of the page to pause and think about that poem before moving on to the next one. So limitations are sometimes there's a lot of metaphoric language, higher order thinking that can be a challenge, but also can be interesting to give our students the chance to listen to metaphoric language. High-low readers, books specifically written for older students who struggle with reading. They include a lot of picture support. They explore topics of interest to teens, but the limitation is the readability levels are often similar to leveled readers, and so they have those same types of limitations. And then we have what's not listed here are classics in all sorts of formats. And so chapter books and novels are not, traditional novels are not listed here, but classics can be found in any of these picture books. Contain Shakespeare, Romeo and Juliet, or you might find those in leveled readers, picture books, graphic novels, novels in verse, etc., versions of those types of stories. And then biographies, stories about important people in science, history, and the arts at a variety of lengths. And a lot of those are going to be encapsulated in the narrative nonfiction picture books that we talk about today. And so looking at all of those factors, we have the student, we have the text type, the strategies and supports, and our purposes for sharing those books. Now, it's absolutely essential, of course, to share decodable books with our students. But to share the rich vocabulary and language sentence structure with them, we may need to expand that. And often what I do with my students is read books to them. And so these are some of the books that I have shared with my students. Think about how, for a minute, how this might fit into your role and what you're doing. So as a speech language pathologist, when I was working in the public schools, I might only have 60 minutes a week to share with a group of students where I had a lot of goals to cover, vocabulary, and improving questioning, and improving understanding of narrative structure. And so to choose a book that is short, and this is another reason for choosing narrative nonfiction picture book, is they are short. You might be able to read one in 15 to 20 minutes. And so I could spend part of the session reading the book and then part of the session talking about text structure, having them retell narratives, which is a big part of what we do as speech language pathologists. Seeing how a student can retell the story that they've heard. Can they remember the details? And this relates very much to our everyday life, our ability to recount the events of our day or the events of our experiences. And all of these books have main characters who are actual people who have overcome great obstacles. And so building emotional resilience. So I choose books, picture books, because they're short. They build emotional resilience. They're examples of people overcoming obstacles. They tie to the science, history curriculum. And so, moving on. And so that's why I use narrative nonfiction picture books as a speech pathologist. As a parent, these are wonderful books to share with students. We're going to talk a little bit later about a panel I'm doing with authors where we talk about sharing a picture book and then questions that we can ask, not questions that are comprehension questions, but questions to open up our experiences, to talk about, this book makes me think of this and my past experiences, and sharing those between a caregiver and a child, or even your older students, your older children. So as a parent, wonderful ways to form connections. As a speech pathologist, I've talked about a little bit why I use narrative nonfiction picture books. As someone working with dyslexia intervention, I want to remind my students what all their hard work is for. Learning to decode, learning to read, if you have dyslexia, is an uphill battle. And I want to periodically remind them, what are we working for? What are we working towards? And so ways that I can integrate that into my sessions is, if I have a picture book and I know it's going to take me about 15 minutes to read the picture book, then maybe I take the last 5 minutes of our session and read a little bit of that picture book while the student is listening and sketching the parts of the story, which they will then help them remember the next day. When we come back and read a little bit more, we'll review what we've already read, and then they have pictography representation of what they've read. We often storyboard that during another session. During another session, they might retell what they've read. We might talk about its connections to the curriculum or how inspiring the book was. Also, this time of year, typically I just carve out a little bit of time each day, and I don't always do it every day, but as I can, I like to share some of these books. But at this time of year, my students, I don't know about yours, but my students are all going through testing, last few weeks of school, and teachers are catching up on all the testing they weren't able to do earlier in the year, and my students are exhausted. So I might even take a longer period of time to share an entire picture book with them, because I want to keep going with our goals and with our objectives with decoding, but I also want some time to just have some downtime to just enjoy books. And this is a great time of year to do that. So I'm going to share now some of these titles, and I've kind of put them into categories. These are loose categories because a lot of these books could certainly go into other categories. That's why I choose them, because they kind of cross these different categories of books. So disability and illness. Thank You, Mr. Falker is written by Patricia Polacco. She is the author and illustrator, and this book talks about her experiences with dyslexia, being bullied because she couldn't read aloud in class, and one important teacher who noticed that she was having struggles and worked with her and also got her after school help for her reading. And now she is a very well-known author and illustrator. She has videos on readingrockets.org where she talks about her struggles with dyslexia, being bullied in school. And it's wonderful to share these books and then share some perspective from the author. Reading Rockets also has videos of other authors who talk about their experiences with dyslexia. You would be surprised to find out how many children's authors have dyslexia. Dave Pilkey, the creator of Captain Underpants and the Dogman series, talks about his struggles with dyslexia and how in second grade he was sent out into the hall because he was always disrupting the class, and he started drawing comics in second grade that eventually became the Dogman series. Henry Winkler created the Hank Zipser series. Hank Zipser is loosely based on his experiences as a child growing up with dyslexia. And that's another great experience, or another great example of tying in a conversation, a video with an author who's actually struggled themselves. Six Dots, one of my favorite children's books of all time. Six Dots, a story of young Louis Braille. When Louis was a young child, he was in his father's workshop and he poked his eye with a tool and it got infected. The infection spread to his other eye. And by the time he was 5 years old, he was completely blind. What he wanted more than anything else was to be able to read books. But of course, there were no books for blind children, children with visual impairments in his village. And so at the age of 10, he went to the Royal School for the Blind. He had to leave home, and it was not, despite the term royal, it was not fancy at all. In fact, it was an old prison, and it was made over into a school for the blind. It was cold, it was damp, the food, there wasn't very much food to eat. The older children bullied the younger children, but he stayed because he wanted to read. Only the best students were allowed in the library, so he endeavored to be one of the best students. And he was so excited when the day finally came that he was able to go to the library. But the letters in the books were made of wax. They were actual letters made of wax, and one word would be the size of his hand. The books were huge, and one sentence would take up half a page. And so it wasn't very long before he was through the book, and he hadn't read very much. He realized that this was not going to be his opportunity to become a great reader. And so he was pretty despondent at that point. Soon afterward, though, an army captain sent a secret code of dots to the school, to the headmaster, who shared it with the students, who were very excited that they could feel the dots and they could read messages, send messages to each other. However, soon the code was so complicated that it was not going to last. It was not something that the kids were going to stick with. Louis, however, thought that if he could simplify this code, he could come upon something that students with visual impairments could use to read and to write. So he asked the headmaster of the school to ask the army captain to help him. And of course, the army captain had no interest in simplifying his code. So Louis Braille set out to work on it himself about the age of 12, approximately. And there's this wonderful illustration in the book. Now, I've received permission from the publishers to share the covers, but I don't have permission to share the illustration. So I want you to just imagine this illustration where he's this 12-year-old boy sitting in this hard wooden chair with a stylus, poking holes in paper, trying to create a code. And at the foot of his chair are hundreds of pieces of paper that are all of his failed attempts, all of the attempts that he tried and tried and tried, and they didn't really go anywhere. This is such an engaging illustration because it reminds me so much of our students who write something and they're frustrated with it and they throw it on the ground, and they write something and they erase it and they throw it on the ground, and their desk is littered with papers. And this illustration just shows that extreme frustration. He works for 3 years. And at the end of 3 years, though, he has created the Braille alphabet. He's 15 years old when he does that. And so he has the headmaster dictate a chapter of a book to him, which he then writes to dictation with his code, turns the page over. He's able to read what he's written, and he has created, at the age of 15, the Braille alphabet. Emmanuel's Dream, the true story of Emmanuel Afoso Yeboah. Emmanuel was born in Ghana, West Africa, with a deformed leg. And at that time, any child who was born with any sort of deformity was considered cursed. So his father left home, never to come back. His mother, though, she believed in him, and she taught him that he could have anything he wanted if he worked for it. Most children with disabilities did not go to school. She carried him to school 2 miles both ways until he was just too big for her to carry him. And then he hopped 2 miles to school and 2 miles back each day. He shined shoes to make money. He bought a soccer ball. None of the kids wanted to befriend him until he bought the soccer ball. And then he had something that no one else had. And so then he made fast friends. His grandmother found crutches for him so that he could support himself and play soccer on the crutches. His friends taught him to ride a bike. But at the age of 13, his mother became very sick, and he left home and went to the big city of Accra at the age of 13 to find a job to support his family, but no one would give him a job. They told him that people with disabilities were expected to beg in the streets, and his mother had told him to never beg. And so he kept looking until he finally found a job. He supported his family for many years, but his mother became more and more ill. She finally died. He decided he wanted to do something to honor her memory. And so he got a shirt that said "The Pozo." And in his language, that means the persons with disabilities. And so a person with a disability. He rides 380 miles all around Ghana, and he meets reporters, and he meets politicians and people who have never come out of their house. Now think about this culture where if you have a disability, you are put in the house. Some of these people had never come out of their house, and they see this guy riding on a bicycle with one good leg, and he inspires the entire nation. In 2006, Parliament passed the Persons with Disabilities Act, and he was very influential in that. Sadako is a book by Eleanor Kerr and Ed Young. It's about radiation that occurs after the nuclear bomb was dropped in Japan. It's about a young girl who develops leukemia, and she becomes hopeful that if she creates 1,000 paper cranes, there's also a chapter book called The 1,000 Paper Cranes, that she will recover from her leukemia. And so her friends and family all gather papers to create these cranes, and she actually does not. She does not make it. She dies. But her story spreads throughout Japan. Her story spreads throughout the world, and she becomes a symbol for peace. So if I haven't convinced you yet that these are not just stories for little kids, I hope you're beginning to see how rich these picture books can be. I'm going to need to go a little more quickly now. I'm in the service of time, but there is a list. Remember, these books are going to be included in a link, and you can download them to get more information about them. So Counting on Catherine, How Katherine Johnson Saved Apollo 13 by Helene Baker, illustrated by Dal Fumerick. Very interesting. This illustrator is actually a medical doctor. The illustrator is a pediatrician, and she is able to do amazing things, convey complicated ideas of physics and mathematics through her illustrations, largely because of her science background. So in Katherine Johnson, if you've ever seen the movie Hidden Figures, she was one of the human computers that worked on the Apollo 13 mission. And when she was 10 years old, she was so smart that she had moved up through grade school. She was ready for high school at the age of 10, but because of segregation, she was not allowed to go to the high school in the city where she lived. And so her family moved across the state so that she could attend high school. And then she graduated from college, focused on mathematics in her studies, but not only did she fight racism, but also sexism, because women were kind of pigeonholed into jobs as teachers or nurses at that time. But she kept wanting to work as a mathematician, finally got a job working for NASA, and was very instrumental when there was an explosion in space and with getting Apollo 13 back home. Mr. Ferris and His Wheel by Catherine Gibbs Davis, illustrated by Gilbert Ford. George Ferris wants to build an attraction for the Chicago World's Fair. Lots of interesting challenges with engineering, creating this very first ever Ferris wheel. And then Mesmerized, How Ben Franklin Solved a Mystery That Baffled All of France. So Hans Mesmer, Benjamin Franklin had gone to France asking for financial support from the king and queen. And then King Louis asked for Ben Franklin's support because Hans Mesmer was causing quite a stir. He was telling people that he could cure them with a magic wand and charging great amounts of money to do so. And so Ben Franklin, using the scientific process, said, well, let's blindfold these people and see if so he would pass this wand or pass a hand over different parts of their body, and they would say, oh, I feel my shoulder burning, or I feel a fire in my stomach. So Benjamin Franklin said, let's blindfold them and see if they can still tell where your magic wand is moving. And of course they could not. But this is a delightful book that explores concepts like the placebo effect, scientific method, hypothesis, and of course one of the first blind studies, and vocabulary like where the term mesmerized comes from. And then, of course, war. Books that have themes of war are always showing some of the most significant struggles of human beings. And so Lynn Cheney's book on when Washington crossed the Delaware is a very dramatic story. But it's interesting to compare and contrast that story with Gingerbread for Liberty. So Gingerbread for Liberty is this funny, at first, comic story of a gingerbread baker who wants to help win the war. And so he's a little older, he's a little rounder, doesn't have, can't really go fight with the troops. So he decides to bake gingerbread for the troops. He becomes a cook, supporting the military efforts in that way. But what's interesting about him, and you can kind of tell from the cover, this is a lot of fun and humor in this book. When the King of England sent Hessian soldiers over to America, he spoke their language. And so he actually infiltrated those troops and convinced them to come over to the American side. So he was instrumental. And so what these books show us is that our skills and our talents, we're not always the general or the president. Sometimes we're just the baker, but we still have something important to offer. Magic Ramen is another story about using food and cooking to overcome a problem. And so the story of Momofuku Ando, written by Andrea Wang and illustrated by Kana Urbanowitz, is a story of a man who sees these long food lines after World War II in Japan. People are hungry and starving, and he endeavors to create a food that is nutritious and easy to prepare. His first several attempts do not go well. And this is another example of a book where we show struggle after struggle, attempt and failure, and finally success. Finding Winnie is the true story of the world's most famous bear. In case you didn't know, Winnie the Pooh was actually a real bear. And then, actually, before I go here, do a little fun introduction. There was a person from history who once, someone very famous, someone we've actually mentioned already, who wanted to totally revolutionize spelling. And when I shared this particular book with my students, they're on board. He wanted to have one letter equal one sound. Wouldn't that be wonderful? Then the English language wouldn't be so complicated. And so he endeavored to create a new alphabet where A wouldn't, the sound A wouldn't have different spellings. It would have one spelling. And a digraph, instead of being SH or TH, he would create a new symbol just for that digraph. And so very innovative. And I wonder if you can guess who that person was. One of our founding fathers? Well, it was Benjamin Franklin. However, this was one of his efforts that did not go very well. An inconvenient alphabet. Ben Franklin and Noah Webster's Spelling Revolution by Beth Anderson and illustrated by Elizabeth Badley. And so he tried to create this new alphabet and nobody was interested in it. They liked things just the way they were. Thank you very much. So he kind of put his new letters aside until Noah Webster came along, and Noah Webster had a similar idea. And so they got together and they worked on this idea together and went out and tried to test drive it with people, and no one liked their new alphabet. There were some issues with it. It's not that easy to create a new alphabet, And it ended up that Benjamin Franklin died and his new alphabet never became a reality. He had lots of successes in his life. This was not one of them. However, what Noah Webster wanted to do was basically to unify spellings and pronunciations. And so he created Webster's dictionary. So although they didn't create a new alphabet, the dictionary that he created became very instrumental to kind of unifying the spellings and pronunciations that we use today. Race Around the World is the true story of Nellie Bly and Elizabeth Bisland, two journalists who want to beat the record for Around the World in 80 Days, to travel around the world. That novel was popular at their time, and they actually set out to see if they could beat the record of making it around the world in 80 days. And then, bad news for outlaws, the remarkable life of Bass Reeves, Deputy U.S. Marshal. Bass Reeves started life as a slave, and slaves were not taught to read and write. So when he became a deputy U.S. Marshal, he could not read the arrest warrants. And so although he was very successful at catching the bad guys and sometimes donning clever disguises to infiltrate their camps, he had to have someone else read the arrest warrants to them. And he would memorize the arrest warrants and then go out searching in the Wild West for these criminals. And sometimes he would have to memorize up to 30 warrants at a time. And so even though this is not specifically a story of someone with a reading disability per se, he definitely had reading challenges. So now, coming to the part of my talk where we talk about some of these authors, we are going to do an event on June 1st, and there will be a link if you're interested in joining this event. It's an author panel on promoting storytelling with kids. And so these authors have books that are featured in my book, Story Frames. But the reason for a panel is to give ideas for sharing books. And so I have a handout, it's a 2-page handout, and it's called Picture Books for Reminiscing. And this is a great way for caregivers, parents, to share books with their students, with their children, to stimulate a conversation. So for instance, Counting on Catherine. So the handout has a little summary of what the book is about. Katherine Johnson was one of the Black computers from the movie Hidden Figures. And she overcame sexism and racism to become a NASA mathematician. And so some questions after you read this book with your student or with your child: have you or someone you know ever been told you couldn't do something important to you? How did you react? Have you or someone you know ever had to use math to solve an important problem? And then An Inconvenient Alphabet. This is the author, Beth Anderson, former classroom teacher. Again, Dow is the illustrator. She is a pediatrician. Beth Anderson is a former classroom teacher. We just talked about her book. So questions: have you ever had an idea that was really important to you, but other people just didn't understand it? Was there at least one person who understood your idea and liked it? And how did it turn out? Watercress by Andrea Wang. This is a wonderful story. It's a memoir, actually, of her experience. Her parents were Chinese immigrants, and when she was young, they would sometimes stop by the side of the road to pick watercress, which they would then prepare for dinner. And of course, as a young child in America, she was mortified because free was bad. And so to her, that was embarrassing that they would be picking food off of the side of the road to eat, until her mother shared the story that when they were in China, her brother, Andrea's uncle, basically starved, that the family, all they had to eat was watercress. And so she had a newfound appreciation for her parents. So basically, some questions with that. Have you ever been embarrassed because other people seem to have nicer things than you? Have you ever learned something about a family member or a friend that made you appreciate them and their experiences? This is going to be a very lively conversation with these three authors. We're going to talk about these books of theirs as well as some other books. And this download with these different questions is something that you can download now. And then this is a video I created just last month with some authors also whose books appear in story frames. Vonda Michaud Nelson wrote Bad News for Outlaws. She is a retired librarian. Lois Ruby wrote Steal Away Home. It is not a narrative nonfiction picture book. It's actually a novel based on the Underground Railroad, the fictional novel. She's a former librarian. And then Caroline Starr Rose, she's the one who wrote A Race Around the World and Maybe, which is a verse novel. And so we all got together and we created some tips for summer reading and enhancing leisure reading, which of course includes summer reading. And so this is also one of your downloads that you can download. There will be a link available for that. They have some really wonderful perspectives. Vonda talks a lot, not so much in this video, but we've had conversations about, as a librarian, she would often direct adults to the children's section. So for instance, if adults came in saying, I'm traveling to Rome, I'm traveling to Paris, and I want a book about the area, she would direct them to the children's section. Often they would be perplexed. Why did you send me here? And it's because these books are succinct. They have a lot of information in a short, small space, and they would inevitably come back and thank her and tell her that those were the best books for their travels. So one of the things we talk about in this video, there's a link to the video also here, is reading aloud with your kids and the importance of reading aloud with your students, no matter what their age. And so when we do that, we model texts that maybe are a little bit above their reading level. Sentence structure, vocabulary, we model strategies for how we approach texts. Sometimes I need to go back and look at something and reread it, or I might want to predict what's coming ahead. And so when we read with our students, no matter their age, we get to model how skilled readers read. These are the links, and these will also be available for you on the Facebook page. References, I'll also make a separate page for that. And that leads us to our question and answer.
Carolee, thank you so much for all those great book suggestions. I was taking notes while you were talking. We have a little bit of time for some Q&A. So I think the first question is, in this digital age, why is it still important for us to help our kids, especially the ones who are reluctant or not proficient readers, still foster a love of books?
Well, especially in our digital age. And I actually really like digital books. I am not someone who dislikes digital books. Obviously I have an office full of actual hold in your hands books, but digital books are interesting in their own way. And like I said, with a digital book, you can highlight a word, you can look it up. There are built-in supports right there. And so stories are important for us, whether they're digital or whether they're hardcover, whether they're something we hold in our hands. They're important because stories are basically the way we organize our history. And one of the things about the reminiscing, sharing those picture books, is when we reflect on our experiences and read a book together and say, oh, this reminds me. And that's what these questions, again, the questions I just read to you are not meant to test a child's knowledge. Were they really listening? It's meant to start a conversation. And so what stories of all kinds help us do is to build autobiographical memories, to organize the events of our life, to make sense of the things that happen to us, the things that we struggle with, and the things that we overcome.
That's wonderful. Thank you. And I still remember going to the library with my dad as a really young child and picking books and running home and reading them and asking to go back the next day and annoying my mother endlessly with my voracious appetite for books. So it was funny. As my kids got older, I wanted to instill that in them as well. But then we realized they had dyslexia, so that, I clearly separated out the love of books and stories from the act of reading, because one was a high interest and treasured experience, and one was, torture and drudgery. So we made a really unconscious but then conscious decision to foster a love of stories, even while we were acknowledging that, we had some pretty poor readers in our house. You mentioned the importance of students choosing books, and I know that there are different purposes for selecting books, but talk a little bit about why that act of choosing books is important for a student, even if it's a book that they may not be able to read.
Right. So when we choose books, and as an adult, imagine if you were told, okay, this is the book you're reading this month, and this is the book you're reading next month, and you never developed a sense of, I'm not even sure what type of books I like. So when it comes to leisure reading, if we're told all through school, this is the book and then this is the next book, and a lot of times there's a book and a test, and there's not this rich conversation. I remember when my daughter was in honors English, and she told me some of the titles she was reading, and I said, oh, you must be having some great conversations. And she said, no, we're just having tests. Read a book and have a test, read a book and have a test. And so if that is all you're doing, and you never have a chance to go to the library, like you're saying, go to the library and choose a book, then when it comes time to you have free time, you're not going to have any idea of what you're even interested in. Now, I will say we have to be cautious with kids who have difficulty decoding, not to just have them pick a book and then start reading it and then revert back to their old habits of guessing at every other word. We don't want to do that, and I don't want to promote that in any way at all. That's where the supports come in, where if this is a book, and as kids make progress through their dyslexia remediation, we're hoping that they can have more choice of those books. But if they choose a book that is above their reading level, then what are the supports that we can offer to them, either reading with them or providing a reading pen that will, for words that give them difficulty, or Bookshare, that type of thing.
I love the story about all the librarians that you've worked with and spoken with and interviewed. And a great librarian, I think, is such an amazing, resource that we have in our public libraries. As you were talking, though, it reminded me of a student that I worked with a long time ago who was profoundly dyslexic and in second grade, and really reading at a pre-kindergarten level. And so reading was very laborious, and yet, they loved stories, they had a great vocabulary, and they loved telling stories. It was the reading that was hard. And this student's school librarian had told them at the beginning of the year that they could only pick out books that they could read. And so what was this, what should have been a really fun social time of school and maybe an escape from, not being able to read, ended up being a traumatizing event, because this student didn't want to go and get baby books and have all of his peers, see that he wasn't reading like them. And so just the act of going to library was an awful experience within his school day. So, I think that as people are listening to this, I hope we get some librarians, and they can be thoughtful about exposing students to a love of book and fostering that. Even if it's not a book that they can read themselves, they can bring it home and have, a parent or another person read it with them. So thanks for getting some great librarian insight into this. I think that is just about all we have time for. Maybe one more question. So as you're talking with teachers and as they're trying to help foster, a love of reading and a love of stories, and using stories to really get a point across as they're trying to cover content, how can teachers in a, public classroom that has a lot of kids manage the needs of the kids who are struggling to read and the struggling to comprehend, and also the kids who just don't have an interest or can't attend to a story that's even being read aloud to them? How do you infuse a classroom with a love of books and reading and stories, given that you have such a varied degree of student proficiency?
I'm not sure if this is a direct answer to your question, but it does make me think of a project I once did with a classroom teacher. She had a class of students, all struggling readers at the high school level. And we read a graphic novel called Tantalize by Cynthia Leidig Smith, and it was based on a novel of hers. It was a vampire novel. And so we read the graphic novel, beautiful graphics. And so the kids were engaged. So we were very conscious about picking something that they were engaged with. We read the graphic novel, and then I found a Dracula, basically the actual Dracula novel that was at a third grade level. It was redone as third grade level, leveled reader. And so basically they read these books. We compared and contrasted them. We wrote an essay together about comparing and contrasting these two books. But then I went to the library and I just gathered up every book I could find that had anything to do with vampires or Dracula, including the original Bram Stoker's Dracula, which is about this thick. And then for kids who finished reading the books that we had assigned, they had some choice. And they were books at different reading levels, books with different types of visual supports. And so they had some choice around those books. They were also able to read other books in Cynthia's series that were related to the first book. And then, because I know Cynthia, we wrote a letter to her. And that was the most surprising thing, because it was authentic writing. And I asked them to mention a favorite part of the book. And so we structured it kind of like a 3-paragraph essay, and they wrote her a letter, and they worked harder on that letter than on any other writing assignment.
Oh, that's great.
And even the really struggling readers, they came in with special stationery. They said they practiced right, because they knew it was going to an authentic person who then wrote back to them.
Oh, that's awesome. I know that you and I have wanted to sit down and have a long talk about books, and I'm sorry that we're running out of time, and I look forward to continuing our conversation another time. But thank you so much for joining us today. Those books were wonderful suggestions, and I encourage everyone to follow up and see Carol Lee in any of her upcoming events that she mentioned. So as we close out today, I just want to thank you all for joining us. I want to remind you to check out IDA's digital library at dyslexialibrary.org. Also check out our videos at idatv.org. Please submit some teacher appreciation nominations, and the registration is open for IDA's 2021 Dyslexia Conference. So please plan to join us in Charlotte in person or remotely for DyslexiaCon 2021. Thanks so much, everyone. Have a great afternoon or evening, depending on where you are, and join us again for another Motivational Monday. Carol Lee, thank you so much. It's always a pleasure to speak with you. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.
You too. Bye-bye.